So last week when I was telling you about what we were going to be doing today, I said that Russell is going to be extending what he said about descriptions to names as well. And this is exactly where descriptions are going to come back and relate to names. Because there's just an obvious question at this point. So we saw that Russell has this argument against the million view on the basis of his acquaintance principle or the metasemantic principle. That view is basically just inconsistent with the idea that in order to know the meaning of a name, you have to be acquainted with the object which it is the name of. But then the obvious question is, well, what is the alternative? What is the meaning of a name? And basically what Russell says is that most things that appear to be names actually work much more like descriptions. In fact, really most names just have the same meaning as a certain kind of description. So how might that work? So this is exactly where the knowledge by description becomes really important. Because Russell's basic thought at the beginning was, well, there are these two classes of things that we're able to think about, the ones that we're acquainted with and the ones that we're not. And the ones that we're not acquainted with, the reason why we're able to think about them is because we associate some description with them, which allows us to think about them. And Russell's basic idea is that, well, for names that are the name that we use to talk about things we're not acquainted with, the meaning of that name is just the description that allows us to think about that object. So take the Mark Twain example, for instance. I'm able to think about Mark Twain, even though I've never met him. The reason is because I know him by description. Something similar applies to the name, but it's not about knowledge, it's about meaning. The meaning of the name Mark Twain, well, it can't be the object, Russell thinks, because I'm not acquainted with Mark Twain. I've never perceived him, I was never in his environment, and he's not me. So instead, it must be that the name has the same meaning as some description, in particular the description that we use to pick him out. So basically, Russell would say the name Mark Twain, that really just means the author of Huck Finn. And this is Russell's theory generally. Almost all names we use are really descriptions in disguise, because almost all names are names of things that we're not acquainted with. Very few things, of all the things that we could possibly talk about, there are far more things that we've never been acquainted with that we can talk about than ones that we are acquainted with. How are we able to talk about them then? Russell asks. The answer is because the names of the things that we're not acquainted with are really descriptions. So we saw in the other case that when we're not acquainted with something, Russell thinks we're able to think about it because we know it by description. And in fact, the names of the things we're able to think about and we are able to talk about that we're not acquainted with are just descriptions. So to give one more example, I talked about Kanye West and how I'm not acquainted with Kanye West. What then does the name Kanye West mean? Well, Russell would think, well, it means something like the guy who interrupted Taylor Swift at the VMAs. The name Kanye West, it's really a description in disguise. It has the same meaning as some description. Now notice, of course, for instance, in the Kanye West example, my description also used a name, like the VMAs or Taylor Swift. Also in the case of Mark Twain, Huck Finn is the name of a book. But Russell is thinking really the full description would eliminate this as well, in favor of some description. So fully spelled out, this would be something more like the author of the book about a boy set in the Deep South in the 19th century. Fill in the details about the story of Huck Finn. Likewise, we had the example Kanye West. We said it means something like the guy who interrupted Taylor Swift at the VMAs. Well, notice that contains two names, Taylor Swift. Maybe the VMAs are a name. But Russell thinks, well, really what we do is we just do the same thing again. We would get rid of the name and replace it with a description that means the same thing. And he thinks that for any name, if you do this for long enough, you'll be able to come up with a description that only talks about things that you're acquainted with. Now for Russell, ultimately, this will be just a description about sense data. We don't necessarily need to say that because we're not going to necessarily take on board everything he says about sense data. So maybe you can be directly acquainted with, like, guys. So we don't need to paraphrase that in terms of sense data. And maybe you can be directly acquainted with the property of somebody interrupting somebody else. So once these are replaced with descriptions in terms of properties and objects that we're acquainted with, we'll have a description whose only components are things that we're acquainted with. Now, as we'll see, it's maybe a bigger question than Russell thinks whether you really can spell out these descriptions at the end of the day. But Russell thinks you can. He thinks that any description we use, which means the same thing as a name, that itself contains a name, we could eliminate the name in terms of a description which eventually contains only talks about things that we're acquainted with. And of course, this would mean that this view would then be consistent with his metasemantic principle, because effectively his metasemantic principle says you can only know the meanings of names of things that you're acquainted with. He thinks that, like, well, everything that isn't a name of something you're acquainted with is a description which is stated in terms that ultimately bottom out in descriptions of things that you are acquainted with. So he thinks that basically anytime you're talking about something you're not acquainted with, the meaning of that is just a long description in terms that you are acquainted with. Now, it might actually take a long time to spell that out, like it might take a long time to spell out Taylor Swift and the VMAs in terms that you're fully acquainted with. But Russell thinks, in principle, it could be done. It is worth mentioning, before we finish up this video, though, that Russell does think that there are some names that really are million names. So his view is a bit unlike So his view here is a bit unlike the views we've seen before, because all the views we've seen before have taken a stand either all going one way or all going the other way. So for instance, for Mill, no names have connotation, all they have is reference. For Frege, all names have both sense and reference. Russell's view, on the other hand, is what we might call a bit disjunctive. He thinks the vast majority of names work in the way that we've just said. Most names are really disguised descriptions. For most names, what they really mean is just some description. On the other hand, though, he thinks there is a handful of names that actually do pick out things directly. So for instance, think about the word I. Now obviously that doesn't mean just one particular person, it depends on who's saying the word. But focus on a particular usage of it. So maybe when I say the word I, that refers to me. Russell thinks that that is a case of a genuine name, where the word really does refer to me. And it can be a name, it's consistent with his view because, remember, we said we're acquainted with ourselves. So he thinks the word I, as used by a particular person, is one of the rare cases of something which is a real name and not like a secret description. Another example is like when you think about calling something that. When you pick out something by saying that thing, you maybe point to it to fix on what exactly you're talking about. Particularly if you're pointing at something you're acquainted with through perception, he thinks that that is a way to talk, that basically functions like a name. So obviously what the word means varies from use to use, but if you again, like the case of I, if you focus on a particular use of that thing, to really indicate it and to successfully pick out an object in the first place, you would have had to be acquainted with it. So that thing, or just that, is another rare occasion of something that really is a name. Now, Russell really goes to the extreme here because of this thing about sense data that we said before. He thinks there's like almost nothing in the world that we're acquainted with. Like he certainly doesn't think there's anything outside ourselves we're acquainted with, because everything outside ourselves, well, we only indirectly perceive it through sense data. It's the sense data that we're really acquainted with. If you don't buy the stuff about sense data, you can say that maybe more things are names, or at least used as names, because you can say that there are just more things that we're acquainted with. But certainly there are going to be a lot of things for which we're able to talk about, we know the meaning of the name, and yet we're not acquainted with it. So for a lot of things, if you buy Russell's argument that you have to be acquainted with something in order to know the meaning of it were a name, you get the conclusion that most of the names that you use, most of the names that you know, are really going to be secret descriptions.